Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And thank you so much. Great to be back here for us as this podcast is being recorded. We are still here in the month of February and the middle of a crazy winter here in the ATL. And I am happy to be joined, per usual, by Mr. Cody. How in the heck are you, buddy?
Freezing. It's like 64.
Oh, it's brutal. It's another brutal winter day here in Atlanta.
We did have, all of the United States had like an Arctic blast of sorts recently.
Yeah. It usually, if it hits here, right, it's maybe a day, and then it kind of goes away. And this year we haven't even had a snowflake, I don't believe. We've had nothing in the way of snow so far, but a lot of rain.
Well, what's interesting is one of our board members, actually the chairman of the Board of Presidents, was just in town, and he's in Australia. I just read, they've had temps up to 106 degrees.
Yeah.
So all of our friends that listen from Australia, which may only be one.
Yes.
106 degrees. And they went on to say that snakes for survival were climbing through people's toilets.
Yes. And so if you're having a bad day, just remember, at least you don't have any snakes in your toilet.
Which got us talking when Robert was here about Christmas.
Yeah.
And how Christmas for them is like midsummer heat.
It is, yeah.
So all those Christmas songs about winter and cold, and
right,
that just doesn't resonate with them.
They have to redo everything. So they're like singing "Baby, It's Hot Outside."
How long you work
instead
on that
of "Baby, It's Cold"? that's yeah. How bizarre!
That is wild.
That's
so
wild.
Regardless of where you're at, glad you're here. Glad you're listening. And Doug, last week we started a conversation on faith.
Yes.
And we started getting hot towards the end of the podcast. So I want to do our best to try to pick up where we left off. But there's lots to talk about when we talk about faith, and we'll slowly try to get to some of these. But I want to pick up where we left off on the last episode, because we went straight to the biblical narrative, and we started talking about Abraham and Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned about these two threads that flow throughout the narrative. And Abraham kind of representing this God as source, and Adam this self as source.
Yeah.
We talked about the grasping. We talked about the need for certainty with Adam. Versus Abraham, who left his father's household, his country, his land, and set out for a location that he didn't know where he was going. And so he went by faith. And then towards the end of the podcast, I got to thinking about, well, wow, I wonder if these two threads run throughout the entire narrative, and then where did they go to? And you talked about them intersecting in Jesus.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I think it would be great. I want to go back to those threads, and then I want to talk about how they intersect in Jesus. But I want to focus in on Abraham for just a minute, and I want to talk about the faith of Abraham, and specifically, what did Abraham place his faith in? So when you talk about Abraham had faith, or like the Hebrews 11 passage, what did Abraham place his faith in, and or who was it? Is we talking about Abraham placed his faith in God? And then the other part of this equation is part of the reason we're even doing this conversation is because faith has never really been the point of all of it anyways. But in again, for many blue meme traditional listeners, faith is the center of it all, and everything hinges on your faith. So those are the things I want to talk about, and I want to continue to trace that thread. So how about we start with Abraham, and then maybe talk about when Abraham leaves his father's household, what Abraham goes by faith. What is Abraham placing his faith in? Or maybe a better question would be, where is that faith pointing?
Yeah, so because Abraham is in the genesis of consciousness, we're being told a story through the narrative about that which is opposed to the Adam approach to God relationship, in that Abraham's faith was one where he trusted in God as the source of all outcomes, all of the outcomes that lead to the abundance of life. And so for Adam, you had an attempt to grasp, an attempt to live through the egoic self as source. And through Abraham, he's saying, I'm going to place my faith, my trust in spirit or God as the source of all outcomes. So there are two different approaches to the way a human being wants outcomes to happen in their lives. Both of those threads, both of those things make up the human being. They make up me. The reason why those two threads are going through the narrative is because those two threads are who I am. I am not a person of faith, and therefore I don't have the Adam instinct in me, the grasping, the self-centeredness. No, I do. I also know that because I have a faith in God, that I become better and better at understanding and observing the ways in which I am acting either out of my fear, which relates to Adam, and my fear, which relates to what I can accomplish or what I'm going to be able to get done or how I'm going to be able to control outcomes in life, as opposed to remembering that it is God and God alone that determines outcomes. And so Abraham is pointing to the other part of the human being. Abraham represents being, Adam represents human. They were both human beings. It's just that Adam wasn't conscious of that which Abraham was conscious of. And so those two threads are going to, again, run the gamut all the way into Jesus, because Jesus is going to represent the universal human being. And that's why they're going to finally find their fulfillment in Christ. But before they can find their fulfillment in Christ, the narrative is going to go through centuries and centuries of history to give example after example of how these two threads are playing out in different human beings.
Okay. Can you give us some of those examples?
Sure. If you look at, for example, the story of Pharaoh, we know that for Pharaoh, you see within the human being the desire to be totally in control. Paul even uses in his writings of Pharaoh as an example. And so if I'm honest with myself, I will understand that I also have this same inclination that Pharaoh had. What was that inclination? That inclination was to control all the outcomes. And Pharaoh absolutely did not place anything in the realm of faith in God. Yet at the same time, you had those like Moses, for example, who was willing to confront Pharaoh. And it's because Moses did have faith in God and had faith that God would be the one that determined the outcome. And as you read the narrative, it tells the story that in the end, when Pharaoh tried to control, which was in the form of a emperor, one who had literally political reign, that when that control was exerted, it absolutely failed. And what was the delivering power was God. And here's the key, Cody, is that the outcome is God as source. Faith is not the reason there's an outcome. Faith is only a belief that God will determine the outcome, but the outcome is always determined by God as source. So the Israelites were not delivered because they had faith, or Moses wasn't successful because he had faith per se. It was that Moses had faith that God would be the deliverer. God would deliver Israel. And so you either had faith or you didn't have faith, and the outcome was going to be determined, the determining factor in that. So that's just one example. And of course, as you go through all these stories, you can see it. I get a kick out of the story of Elijah, where he confronts the prophets of Baal, and he has this great victory on Mount Carmel, I believe it was, where his sacrifice was one that was received by God, and the sacrifices of the false prophets of Baal were completely destroyed in the process. Well, he has this great victory there at that point, and it looks like, as a human being, you're euphoric. Hey, something really great happened. I'm euphoric. God has come through. Then he finds out that the Queen Jezebel is out to take his life because of what's happened, and he goes and sits under a broom tree, and he says, oh my gosh, my life's over. Everything stinks. This shows the range that we have as human beings of either depending on God for an outcome, and then those times when we absolutely say, my life is hopeless. There's no way out. There's no hope for my family, no hope for my relationship, no hope for me. Those threads are constantly running through the narrative, and they had to play out over history, over thousands of years, because you can't just sit down in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve and explain what had just happened and expect that consciousness could evolve in a sit-down meeting. Consciousness has evolved. Worldviews have evolved over millennia. But anyway, those are a couple examples of how that plays out in the narrative.
Okay, I was thinking about the Israelites, and I'm just trying to follow this archetypal pattern that you're talking about, this thread that runs throughout the entire narrative. And let's talk about Israel for just a minute. Israel were the ones who were rescued from this Pharaoh, from this bondage. And again, I think the point that I'm trying to get at, and I don't know, you can correct me here if I'm off, but I think that one of the things that I have observed is even when you follow Israel, this particular tribe of people, what you discover is they were once the oppressed, but then very quickly in the narrative, they become the oppressors.
Yeah.
So to your point, they are rescued from Pharaoh, but then at some point in the narrative, they forget where they came from and or who their source is. And this is what the reason I'm trying to get at this is because both Adam and Abraham, as you would say, runs in both of us, or runs in us. Both of them run in us. And so the point is that what you see by the time Solomon gets there is literally in 1 Kings, it talks about how Solomon used slaves to build the temple to God. And it's almost as if Solomon becomes the new Pharaoh and Israel becomes the oppressors. And what you see is that thread all throughout the Old Testament of both Adam, self as source, and Abraham, God as source. Almost this tension, this back and forth between the two.
Yeah, because there's a tension in me. What we're going to see by the time we get out to Christ is that my nature does not have to be in a state of conflict. Rather, Jesus is going to teach me how my nature can be, quote, integrated, how my nature can be whole, not separated, not against itself, not in conflict. What I mean by that is I've talked with you in the past about Adam. The issue with Adam and the egoic self was not because he had an instinctual self, but because he didn't realize that instinctual self was to play a role and function. And we've used this term over and over again, role and function versus identity. The faith of Abraham was pointing toward true identity. The action of Adam was attaching to his self as source instinctive nature. So I am both of those. I have instincts in both of those. Yet, if I allow my instinctive nature to try to control, because that's its job to protect me, it's going to control in every way possible, or that will turn into coveting, greed, lust, those kinds of things, because it no longer is a role and function. It's literally trying to become my identity.
Okay. And you wouldn't frame those as good and evil. So here's an example.
No.
You know the quote, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking self in spirit.
Yes.
Because I think the danger is, and I understand the point of that quote, the line dividing good and evil cuts to the heart of every man, is getting at or hinting at what we're discussing here.
Yes.
Which is there could be things that transpire or happen as a result of self being source.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that said, these categories, this binary perspective of good and evil, is not a fair label for what we're discussing.
No.
And this is the point that I'm trying to get at, because this instinctual perspective of Adam is not evil in itself.
Right.
This too is also created by the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Absolutely.
in us for a reason.
Yes.
And oftentimes the ego gets demolished as this evil thing inside of us.
Mm-hmm.
But even
Yes.
the writers in the narrative portray it as a mythological devil and or Satan.
Yes.
Thoughts?
Yes. And so for example, desires are all God-given, yet when we get to the story of David, when those desires go beyond their role and function, and he takes Bathsheba, and he does so illicitly, and then it results in the death of her husband, in essence, an act of murder. We're seeing there how a desire moves from a God-given state to lust and coveting, which means that now the instinctive self or ego has gone beyond its role and function. Whereas when you are looking at God as source, all your desires are still there, and you are still a biological being with all those desires. But those desires are not the controlling factor. My instinctual self, with regard to those desires, is not in charge. Because if it is, then like any animal out there, I was watching a show the other day, Cody, on how with a den of lions, a pride of lions, that if a new male comes in and takes over the pride, that male will kill all the cubs so that he can mate with the lioness that are there within the pride. That's the instinct. That's animal instinct. That's operating purely off of animal instinct. They have no consciousness of that which is from image of God, God breathed, etc., in the human. So we have that same within us. People kill each other. People do all kinds of things. We potentially have the potential to do any and everything. But what makes the difference is the degree to which I'm in tune with my true essence, with my God image, with the breath of God within me, that spirit in essence, that differentiates me from all other biological species on this planet. And so we can see that how we can operate like that. Here's a man in David who does something that has to do with immorality and has to do with murder, hate, cover-up, deceit, lying, dishonesty. All of this within the same person who is elsewhere referred to as a man after God's own heart. So that you can see that we have within us that's the tension that you're talking about. It's not good and evil per se. It's the tension between the way we integrate or don't integrate those two aspects of our lives.
Okay, two thoughts. One is, you had mentioned on the last podcast, you said this statement, when we the moment we stop recording, because sometimes these conversations just continue. But you said, yeah, I am every one of these people in the narrative.
Yeah.
Which is the point you're trying to make, which is interesting, because I was thinking about even in the New Testament where the Pharisee, you had the man who's kind of beating his chest, and the Pharisee's like, thank God I'm not like that asshole.
Exactly.
A rough translation.
That's a rough translation.
But basically it's like,
yeah,
man, I'm not a depraved sinner. I kind of have myself together. And in a lot of ways, isn't that how we have kind of approached the narrative? Is we read the parts that we love, like, David, a man after God's heart, like, yeah. But then the parts of adultery and lying and murder, it's like, yeah, that's not me.
Yes.
But in some ways, we resonate with all of these stories.
Yes.
And even though we resonate with them, the one thing we know is that our essence in who we are is this common thread from Abraham forward.
Yeah, and it never changes. I mean, how does one destroy the image of God? How does one get rid of the breath of God? How does one take away that which God has created? It cannot be done. What changes is, again, human consciousness of that which is. That's what's changing. God doesn't change. Our consciousness of God changes.
Okay, so I want to get it. I'm headed somewhere. I'm driving the ship right
great.
now.
Drive on.
Okay, because I want to talk about where these intersect, and then an integral framework of faith. But on this same thread that you say Abraham and Adam intersect in Jesus, and how I'm every one of these people in the narrative, and both these threads reside in us. And you say also that they intersect in Jesus. So even Jesus is the first, last Adam. Okay, well then that brings a big question. So Jesus wrestles with his own humanity, his own flesh. You obviously see that in the temptation, right?
Yeah, because guess what shows up there in that temptation? The same satanic voice that showed up in Adam. This is why Jesus becomes the last Adam, is because that same voice in the garden is the very same voice that's whispering in the ear of Jesus in those three temptations that were offered to him, that had to do with controlling things, ruling the kingdoms, or fame. Jump off the building and let the angels. How famous would I be if I did that? Or wealth. You can have anything you want. Or, hey, if I had the ability to turn stone into bread, I'd never be needy again. I could take care of and be in control of all of my needs. And everything was that same satanic voice. You will surely not die. You will be like God. You will be self-sufficient. You won't even need God because you can have all this for yourself. So that satanic voice that was whispering in the ear of Jesus was the same satanic voice that whispered in Adam's ear. Jesus is a model of how to put that voice in its proper perspective, not because Jesus was saying, no, you don't live by bread alone. You live by every word that comes from God. Jesus wasn't saying, I've transcended my biology. I don't need to eat. Jesus was not saying that his desire and need to eat had to be done away with. What he was saying was, I'm not going to let my desire be the thing that controls me. I'm not going to let it move beyond its natural role and function. Otherwise, I'll do whatever I have to do to get as much bread as possible so that I take care of my needs and I never have to worry about those needs ever. So if I have to be dishonest, murderous, treacherous, whatever, I will do that.
Okay. Do you believe Jesus was perfect in that? So people talk about Jesus being sinless. Right? You knew I was going there, didn't you?
Geez. Okay, yeah.
You knew I was going there.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is I know Jesus represents this, right?
Yes.
He represents God as source.
Yes.
But it seems to me that there is some confusion around that statement. So for lots of people, they're like, yeah, that means every single time he chose God as source. And obviously you see these stories of like being in the wilderness and this satanic figure, again, which I think is a beautiful metaphor, because it does, in some ways, materialize and give art and show us an image of what's actually happening internally.
Yes.
And so Jesus, again, wrestles with these things. So you can call it the devil, you can call it Satan, you can call it the ego, you can call it self as source, you can call it the human of the human being. Was Jesus perfect in that way? And then, because in some ways that, what's the word I'm looking for? Devalues the human of the human being. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge point. In other words, when we talk about Jesus being sinless, are we wanting to make sure that we know that he never lied to Mary and skipped school because he wasn't really sick? Or when he was doing carpenter work with his dad and he hit his thumb with the hammer, he never said a bad word? What are we talking about as far as Jesus being sinless? To me, this again goes back to Jesus being the last Adam. And this is the antithesis of faith, by the way, when again, we're in this whole discussion of faith. It intertwines itself to this living out of these processes in Jesus. But what the sin of Adam was the temptation and the acting upon the temptation to live apart from God, to through self as source have life and sustain through self as source rather than being dependent upon God as the source. And so for Jesus, when Jesus atones for Adam's sin, he's basically atoning or making right the consciousness of Adam, which was moved through self as source. And when Jesus, through spirit as source, says, thy will be done, Jesus has moved consciousness to a level of dependence upon God as spirit and God as the source of all outcomes. And in that sense, Jesus does not sin because he does not attempt to be separated from, remembering that sin and death go together. And the casting out of Adam was a sign that he was being separated in that sense, whereas Jesus, seeing this self as one with the Father, simply did not try to grasp as Adam did. And in that sense, then, Jesus is sinless. Jesus is sinless because of his conscious outlook, perception, and understanding of God and his dependence upon God.
But he still cussed.
Well, I didn't say that. I'll leave that open for all of those that are listening to say, well,
what does that mean?
That sinlessness certainly covered his relationship with Adam. I think, though, when you bring this up and we laugh about it, really the fact of the matter is that through time and over centuries, we have made Jesus something that we couldn't possibly be. And I think the narrative is trying to say, no, Jesus is everything you are. And
that's good, Doug.
And that I just remember there was a song we sang. I can't remember all the part of it, but growing up, there was a song that was, would he devote that sacred head? And the words were, for such a worm as I. They later changed the words to that song to, would he devote that sacred head for such a one as I? Oh. But it shows that the piety movement and those that preceded us in history had gotten to the point where we had made Jesus this figure that was not representative of my humanity. So I like to have that kind of conversation about the humanity of Jesus, and that, of course, would take us down another road.
But I love that because, again, it's the affirmation of the human. And that's not evil. It's good. It's good. And I love that, which could lead us in all kinds of conversations. But that's all the time we have for today. So we'll pick it up next week. Have a good week.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.